I'd just like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us today. It's a really important day for us, and it's really hard to do it in a lecture theatre like this because we really do want to have a conversation together. So apologies that we're a bit sat in rows, but please do speak, because this is about us all really learning together and from each other. And this Freedom Fighters session this morning, we're going to be exploring, as you've all seen, some of those stories of African, Caribbean, South Asian and Irish volunteers who very, very proudly served in the RAF, despite being committed to independence from Britain. So it's a really interesting story, why they chose to do that, how that aligned with their values of independence, and how were they treated by their colleagues in the RAF. It's particularly timely, of course, as well. On the 6th of December this year, we're commemorating the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty that created the Irish Free State and Northern Ireland. And then next year, of course, we've got the 60th anniversary in August of Jamaican independence, and a couple of weeks later, the 75th anniversaries of the independence of Pakistan and India. So it's very timely and very much, of course, in the national conversation at the moment, and internationally, of course. And we, as a museum, are very conscious of the need to explore more the RAF stories relevant to our richly diverse society. And we're building on a highly successful programme over the years. Our Women in the Air Force exhibition right back in 2009, our award-winning Pilots of the Caribbean exhibition in 2013. We're currently reviewing and updating that. And our People's Spitfire pilot poll that we did in partnership with the Daily Telegraph in 2017, which saw Polish pilot Franciszek Kornicki winning that poll with over 350,000 votes for a place in our new centenary exhibitions that opened in 2018. And we're really an opportunity for us to really start pushing our permanent exhibitions further, and we're really conscious of a team that we're still scratching at the surface of this, and there's so much to do, so these conversations are really important. Complementing that, our Hidden Heroes strategy launched in spring 2018, exploring some of the really inspiring and often little known stories of RAF people with our communities, with the RAF, with business partners, and the Jewish Hidden Heroes, and mounted with Chelsea Football Club to challenge anti-Semitism and racism. And Josh is here, who's done so much to progress that with us and for us. That's really going from strength to strength. And we're working closely with South Asian partners too, to highlight the massive contribution made by volunteers, their volunteers during the World Wars. We've discovered so many stories through these projects. And entrusted to our care, we see as a museum is stories of people like Daphne Pearson, who was awarded the George Cross for rescuing a pilot from a burning bomber, Ulrich Cross, who many of you will know from Trinidad, who logged 80 combat missions as a Pathfinder navigator, and Spitfire ASE and Gleed, now proudly claimed by the LGBT community as one of their own. Sadly, in July this year, we lost a very dear friend to the museum, Benny Goodman, Lawrence Benny Goodman, who was in 617 Squadron as one of our Jewish Hidden Heroes. And I shall always have his words ringing in my ear when he was asked, because Jewish Bomber Command, because there was such a likelihood that they'd be shot down, could choose not to have the religion on the dog tag because they would not be treated, of course, as officers. If they were captured, they would have a very different end from the Nazis. And I just always have Benny's words in my ears saying, I was born a Jew and I'll die a Jew. And he turned down that offer not to have Jew written on his dog tag. So we'll all be thinking of him, I think, today. And of course, this is all happening at a time of intense debate about Britain's history and its roots in colonialism and slavery. and that cultural legacy of empire. And in the 18 months since the murder of George Floyd, this debate, of course, has become more impassioned and more polarised. And it's been very clear to us who work in the museums, we've been very much in the eye of this storm across the museum community. Very important, though, that the museum community is absolutely working to welcome the challenge and to be part of that debate, promoting those stories and working to absolutely look at how we're telling our stories. So we're very, very keen, very clear as a museum, we're going to continue that work to create a more inclusive, more relevant and more robust history of the service. That's the role of historians and has always been, and that's the role of museums too. I'm really proud to say that the Freedom Fighters Workshop supported by the Institute of Historical Research, so a very big thank you. And this has helped us to bring together a diverse range of speakers. So we have Dr. Joseph Quinn, who'll be delivering a paper about Major Robert Gregory and the Irish in the RAF. And our historian, Harry, who we've already met, is going to be speaking about the RAF's wartime emigres. Looking to the future, research volunteer for the museum, Russell Smith, will talk about his research into Errol Barrow, while Harry Ladwa, postgraduate student at London University, is going to be discussing the Indian pilots in the First World War. I'm really delighted as well to welcome back to the museum the Sunday Times best-selling author Shrabani Basu. Shrabani wrote Spy Princess, The Life of Noor Inayat Khan, one of the first books I read when I started working at the museum. I'm a social historian rather than a military historian, so yours was one of my first books that I read. And I have to tell you, one of the highlights of my curatorial career over 30-odd years was the day when one of our assistant curators burst into my room when we were planning our centenary exhibitions. We knew we wanted to include Noor's story because it's such an inspiring one. And as a museum, we're about the real object and the power the real object has. And we didn't have an object to illustrate her history, and but we were going to include her RAF history anyway. Peter ran into my room with the logbook of Bunny Rye Mills, who was the RAF pilot who took Noor Khan into occupied France in his Lysander. And so having that tangible evidence, it's a book, but knowing that story is contained in that book has such powerful resonance, and that's the power of the real object and the way we should be thinking about our collections. So welcome. I'm also really delighted to welcome Ruben back, who in 2018 performed Flying Colours, his outstanding one-man show, inspired by the stories of the RAF's black personnel. Thank you for joining us as Ruben. It's good to have you back with the family and looking forward to hearing you. Lastly, we'll close with Nina, who's also very kindly stepped in because Peter, who's our head of collections and research, was pinged last night. So this is the world we live in, and despite being fully vaccinated, didn't want to take any chances. So big thank you to Nina, who's here with us to close and talk a little bit about the role of diversity in the work of the museum. So thank you, Nina. So I'm sure that this fusion of academic thinking, public history, poetry, will really come together to be an enjoyable morning. And I do urge you, please, to join in, speak, share your thinking with us. Thank you for joining us. Harry.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ruben, and I will be reciting a poem. An Irish Airman Foresees His Death by W.B. Yeats. I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight I do not hate, those that I guard I do not love. My country is Kiltartan Cross, my countrymen Kiltartan's poor. No likely end could bring them loss, or leave them happier than before. Nor law, nor duty bade me fight, nor public men, nor cheering crowds. a lonely impulse of delight, drove to this tumult in the clouds. I balanced all, brought all to mind. The years to come seemed waste of breath, a waste of breath, the years behind, in balance with this life, this death.
My name is Dr. Joseph Quinn. I'm former Second World War historian at the National Archives, Kew, and I recently finished working for the Imperial War Museum on the Second World War and Holocaust Partnership Programme. My talk today is Nor Law Nor Duty Bade Me Fight. I'd like to say thanks to Peter Devitt for all his very kind help and efforts in preparing this talk. Nor law nor duty bade me fight. These lines provoke a very stirring thought. If neither law nor duty compels a person to voluntarily risk life and limb flying in a flimsy wood and canvas aircraft over a violent battlefront, then what does? In the case of this particular refrain, it was intended as a tribute from Irish poet W.B. Yeats, commissioned by his benefactor, Lady Isabella Augusta Gregory. The poem is one of 4 that Yeats composed as a memorial to her only son and heir, Major Robert Gregory, a Royal Flying Corps aviator who was killed in action in Italy, shot down erroneously by an Italian aircraft in a friendly fire incident. It immediately presents us with a number of problems. Firstly, Robert Gregory and Yeats never had a good relationship, despite the fact that Gregory, a very accomplished artist and an Irish international cricketer, had worked with him on projects in the Abbey Theatre in Dublin. Secondly, contrary to what the poem suggests, Gregory had neither Irish nationalist sympathies nor anti-imperial sentiments. He was avowedly anti-Sinn Féin and fully supported Britain, the Empire, and the Allied war effort against the Kaiser's Germany. The poem, which was not published until after the war in 1919, perfectly crystallizes the growing Irish antipathy and opposition towards the war in the aftermath of the 1916 Rising, and later with the British government's imposition of conscription in April 1918, which had the effect of turning the Irish public against the war and against Britain and the Empire. Yeats' poem, in fact, pays tribute not so much to Gregory, but to an anonymous Irish airman who is a symbolic figure for the paradoxical nature of Irish service during the First World War. Gregory, on the other hand, is a patrician, Anglo-Irish figure, synonymous with the dominance of his class within the contingent of the British Officer Corps. According to Thomas Bartlett and Keith Jeffrey, in the introduction to their seminal work, A Military History of Ireland, war and the use of force made an indelible and lasting impression on Ireland, an island whose peoples, structures, society, and politics have been for centuries shaped, were not determined by war, by the threat of war, at least by the absence of peace, a small country out of which vast armies of men have poured out to do battle abroad. Irish service in British armed services during the 18th century was rendered under the constraints of the penal laws, which officially restricted Irish Catholics from bearing arms, even in the service of the Crown. This was designed to neutralize any perceived threat posed by the majority Catholic population towards the Protestant ascendancy. However, in the aftermath of the French Revolution of 1789, it resulted in a watershed moment with the passing of the Catholic Relief Act in 1793, which legalized Catholic enlistment in the British forces and permitted them to bear arms and, crucially, to hold officer commissions. Although the way had been opened for Irish Catholics to obtain commissions, the 19th century would not show meaningful progress on this front. This was due to a system of socially exclusive or closed-shop officer selection, where candidates for officer training were either selected for officer training directly from public schools or purchased their commissions, resulting in underwhelming numbers of Irish Catholic officers being found within the British Army, even by the latter decades of the 18th century. The First World War would alter the predominance of the Anglo-Irish officer tradition. The Irish contingent, numbering 210,000, service personnel recruited from across the UK and Ireland would be Protestant and Catholic to a ratio of 2/5 and 3/5 respectively, representing a massive contribution towards British wartime military mobilisation. Although below the rate of voluntary enlistment in Britain during the First World War, Irish enlistments constituted the largest military mobilisation in Irish history. Just over 152,000 of these were recruited in Ireland, of which some 5,000 were officers. The total number of Irishmen to have served as British officers during the war is estimated at 11,000, of whom 5,000 were commissioned during the war. However, Tim Bowman, William Butler, and Michael Wheatley have observed, firstly, the assumption that the long-established military tradition of the Anglo-Irish gentry class continued without any significant variation. Secondly, that a disproportionate number of Irish Protestants made up the bulk of the officers recruited into the British forces. And thirdly, the Catholic nationalists faced discrimination in their efforts to secure officer commissions. While aspects of these assumptions are factual, the three authors have established that the needs of wartime mobilisation instilled significant social mobility within the British recruitment apparatus in Ireland, with a large complement of officers coming from middle-class backgrounds, as in the case of the 10th Irish Division. In the case of the RAF, a relatively new branch of the British forces established in 1918, a strong Irish tradition of service can be traced back to its predecessor in the First World War, the Royal Flying Corps, which was founded in 1912. It is now estimated that over 6,500 Irishmen had served as airmen in both the Royal Flying Corps and its sister service, the Royal Naval Air Service, during the war. In addition, the level of Irish recruitment to the combined air services during the closing months of the war in 1918 reflected an increasing fascination among members of the Irish public with the air war of the Western Front. Some 4,400 candidates were recruited to the RAF in Ireland from the 1st of June to the 15th of October 1918, almost level with recruitment to the British Army during the same recruitment period, and representing an astonishing 45% of the total Irish recruitment for the British forces in this duration. This surge in Irish recruitment during the third quarter of 1918 is noteworthy. The British government were attempting to enforce conscription in Ireland during this period. Bitterly resisted by all factions of Irish nationalism through non-compliance and a vigorous anti-conscription campaign, the law would never be enforced in Ireland, but service in the British forces became a tainted issue in the Irish political sphere. The RAF therefore proved quite popular in Ireland at a time when recruitment to the British forces had become decidedly unpopular. This popularity was almost certainly due to the success of British propaganda in promoting the glamour and fame associated with the air war over France. Some of the most famous aviators of the wartime Royal Flying Corps were Irish airmen, especially the legendary Irish-born fighter ace, Edward Mick Manock, who achieved the majority of his 61 aerial victories over France by the time of his death and was the top-scoring British air ace of the war. Manock, who was the son of a British Army veteran and half Irish on his mother's side, was an independent Labour Party member and a staunch supporter of Irish Home Rule. Nevertheless, like Gregory, he was also an opponent of militant republicanism and supported Britain and the Empire in their war effort against what the Irish war poet Francis Ledwidge called an enemy common to our civilization. A key reason for joining the Royal Flying Corps, according to his biographer Adrian Smith, was because he saw this service as a glamorous alternative to life in the trenches. One of the first Irish wartime pilots to join the early frontline squadrons of the Royal Flying Corps in 1915 was Charles Joseph Mackey. Born in Ochafin, County Westmeath, the son of a prominent Dublin-based solicitor and from a wealthy background on his mother's side, he attended Ampleforth College with his younger brother George Frederick, from where both boys would join the British Army. Mackey, who transferred to the RFC in 1915, having originally served as a platoon commander in an Irish infantry regiment, flew mainly contact, patrol, reconnaissance and bombing missions in numerous campaigns on the Western Front in France. He narrowly escaped capture by rebels on Easter Monday 1916 while having lunch in the Metropole Hotel, just literally across from the General Post Office. He later served in air operations to support British offensives at the Somme in 1916 and Cambrai in 1918. In 1919, he was appointed to command No. 100 Squadron based at RAF Baldonnel, south of Dublin. Mackey would lead counter-insurgency patrols in Crossley tenders and coordinated delivery flights to British garrisons throughout Ireland when their communications had been compromised by the IRA. He would become a pioneering figure in the Royal Air Force, lecturing at the RAF Staff College at Andover and advising the air staff during the interwar years until his sudden death in 1935. It is my contention that Mackey would have become an air marshal had he lived through the Second World War. On the opposite side of this coin, we have former Irish RFC officers who served in the Irish Republican Army, who are connected with insurgent operations against British forces in Ireland. A truce was declared by the British government in July 1921, and Irish delegates were invited to London to negotiate a settlement that would end the conflict in Ireland and give way to Irish nationalist aspirations. Michael Collins, the head of the IRA and Minister for Finance in the Sinn Féin underground government in Dublin, was selected to lead the delegation to Downing Street, where negotiations began in October 1921. He feared that if negotiations collapsed, he would be arrested by the British authorities. An escape plan was formed, with his chief military advisor, Somme veteran Major Emmett Dalton, hiring two ex-RAF officers, Charles Russell and William J. Sweeney, who were both serving in the Dublin IRA. Russell and McSweeney purchased a Martinsyde Type A Mark II four-seater biplane for around £3,000. The aircraft was adapted by both men to carry 6 passengers, and aviation fuel was purchased. The aircraft, which was nicknamed the Big Fella, was kept on standby at an aerodrome near London, ready to fly the actual Big Fella and his entourage back to Ireland if the negotiations floundered. The plane would take off on a bearing for Bristol, fly along the south coast of Wales, and crossing the Irish Sea, make landfall over Rosslare, County Wexford. It would then turn north, following the railway line to Dublin, and land on Leopardstown horse race course in South Dublin. On the 6th of December 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed, thereby negating the need for this contingency. Nevertheless, the Big Fella was delivered to Baldonnel Aerodrome, home of the new National Army Air Corps, as the first aircraft purchased for the Air Force of the new Irish Free State. Charles Russell and William McSweeney, the first RAF airmen to serve the cause of an independent Ireland, were the founders of this service. Irish airmen would not cease to join the British forces after the war, neither during the Anglo-Irish conflict of 1919 to 1921, nor even after Southern Irish independence from the United Kingdom in 1922. According to Stephen O'Connor, throughout the interwar period, Irish soldiers comprised about 5% of the British Army's manpower, and anecdotal evidence suggests that a similar proportion served in the officer corps. If anything, this suggests that the cultural impact of Irish military service in British uniform had become so deeply ingrained in Irish society that it continued unabated despite the independence struggle. One of the more unusual developments which aided Irish recruitment to the RAF during the 1930s was the publication of RAF recruiting adverts in Irish newspapers, together with a wide circulation of British newspapers which printed similar adverts. Indeed, RAF recruiting notices appeared in a number of Irish newspapers, including the Sunday Independent, the Cork Examiner, and the Evening Mail, as late as 1939. The recruiting notice published in the Sunday Independent stated that new unmarried recruits, 17.5 to 25, who were of good physique and who passed their school certificate, were required in large numbers for training and service in the Royal Air Force as air observers. These recruiting adverts provoked an irate response from Irish Republicans, particularly veterans of the Irish War of Independence, who protested against their publication to the government. Although he badly needed to appease the Republican faction of his population, Eamon de Valera had to factor in another consideration, the unemployment problem. It had been the policy of the government of de Valera's predecessor, William T. Cosgrave, which administered the Irish Free State from 1922 to 32, to permit young Irishmen to enlist in the British forces as a means of alleviating the domestic unemployment problem. At a cabinet meeting on the 2nd of December 1930, where the matter of British recruiting activities in the Irish state was discussed, one of Cosgrave's ministers was particularly frank on this matter. He said, "If young men, otherwise unemployed or unemployable, find an outlet for their energies in the British Army, I do not feel that we should, in the present economic conditions, endeavour to prevent them. They are better in the British Army than in our jails." De Valera had inherited a very difficult brief in a very challenging economic climate, and closing off the well-trodden path to the British Armed Forces recruiting offices would have been both impractical and ill-considered at the time. During a time of severe economic hardship, armed services such as the RAF offered abundant employment opportunities to young Irishmen from the mid-1930s, an aperture which De Valera's government sorely needed. The RAF also underwent a rapid expansion between 1934 and 39, when the RAF reached an actual strength of 118,000 men, supported by 45,000 in the RAF Volunteer Reserve. The Air Minister, Lord Swinton, aimed to boost the number of short service commissions by attracting entrants from British public schools and a pilot training scheme for serving non-commissioned officers. However, more recruits outside the UK would be needed to build up a large reserve of trained airmen, and an appeal was made to Dominion countries, with the governments of Australia, Canada, New Zealand and South Africa all being asked to contribute men. The Irish Free State was not likely to have escaped Swinton's attention as a potential recruiting ground, and many incentives were offered to all prospective recruits. Throughout the interwar period, the service became a popular choice among young Irishmen, especially during the 1930s when emigration to Britain from Ireland spiked, with 30,000 Irish immigrants arriving in 1936. According to Stephen O'Connor, the perception of a growing exodus of young men, particularly the middle classes, struck Harold Maguire, a young Trinity College graduate who joined the RAF in 1933 and rose to a rank of Air Marshal in the service. With one young man who was among the flood of Irish migrants to Britain, travelling to London with his family in November 1936, was Brendan Eamon Fanucan. He would enlist in the RAF in 1938, eventually becoming second highest RAF air ace of the war and the youngest wing commander in the RAF to date. Another pre-war recruit to the RAF was John Allman Hemingway, now the last surviving veteran of the Battle of Britain. In the summer of 1937, he was undecided about what to do with his life upon finishing school. He says, "We used to go to Greystones for 3 months every year on our holiday, and in September 1937, I was sitting at the harbour at Greystones, and my father came up to me and said, 'What are your plans for the future?' And my answer was, 'My plans are to do exactly what you're doing, which is absolutely nothing.' I didn't use those words exactly, but I meant that. Well, he didn't wholly agree with that, although he did nothing about it. Later that year, we went over to London, and I was given a medical examination and all sorts of examinations, and I was granted a short service commission in the Royal Air Force, which started in March 38. One of the great myths about Irish neutrality during the Second World War is the idea that Irish nationals faced a complete ban on service in the British forces. Such was not the case. In fact, recent scholarship, which unveils official Irish government memoranda on the subject, underlines the fact that recruitment to the British forces was not only state-sanctioned, but state-sponsored. We have already seen that 2 successive Irish governments viewed British military and naval recruiting in the Irish state as an aperture for both the unemployable and the unemployed, and maintaining a permissive attitude towards such activities. The Irish police force and Garda Síochána often carried out background checks on prospective Irish recruits to the British forces at the request of the War Office, the Admiralty and the Air Ministry throughout the interwar period, a practice that would carry well on into the Second World War. However, with the onset of war in September 1939, accompanied by De Valera's declaration of neutrality, it was obvious that certain restrictions would have to be enforced with regard to British recruiting activities. Firstly, a stringent prohibition on the publication of recruiting adverts in Irish newspapers was introduced. Secondly, the government imposed a zero-tolerance policy on the wearing of foreign military uniforms, specifically aimed at Irish servicemen coming home on leave with the British forces. The strictness of the Irish authorities in enforcing the uniform ban was apparent to Tim Vigors in the early months of the war, or Tim Vigors rather. On the 23rd of December 1939, he completed his cadet training at RAF Cranwell and was returning home to his family in Ireland for his Christmas leave in December 1939. Having boarded the night ferry at Holyhead, he arrived at Dublin port the following morning and made sure to dress inconspicuously. The next morning I packed my uniform into my suitcase and donned my old tweed jacket before we docked. Ireland was a neutral country, and if I appeared in my RAF uniform, I would have been immediately arrested and interned. The normal route for prospective Irish recruits to the RAF during wartime was through Northern Ireland, a British jurisdiction and an active recruiting area. Throughout the war, many Irish nationals took the Belfast train from Amiens Street Station to Dublin in order to enlist in one of the 3 branches of the British forces at the Combined Recruiting Centre on Clifton Street. This facility in central Belfast would be the focal point for Irish recruitment, both north and south, and in the opening months of the war, and at many points throughout the conflict, recruiting booms were recorded at the centre, driven, it seems, by large numbers of Southern Irish candidates who registered there. A total of 71,450 recruits were recorded in all 3 branches from both jurisdictions by the close of the war. Of these, a total of 15,260 men and women from neutral Southern Ireland were registered as having joined the RAF between 1940 and 1945. The British Army, although remaining the most popular service of choice for Irish recruits, was very nearly outdone by the RAF in the latter years of the war, and only recruited 2,500 more Southern Irish nationals than the RAF by 1945, indicating the level of popularity that the service enjoyed in neutral era. This surge occurred in the recruiting period August 1943 to August 1944, when more than 5,000 Southern Irish recruits enlisted in the RAF. This would be the largest surge of recruitment in any one service from either jurisdiction recorded in Northern Ireland during the entire war. I want to very quickly talk about one of the reasons why this happened. You had inspirational examples coming to the fore, such as John Hemingway, who got his first kill on the 10th of May 1940 when the Battle of France opened. You had Donald Garland, who was awarded the VC for flying a ferry battle on the bombing mission at Lanarkon in Belgium on the 12th of May. You had John Bullhalligan, a legendary squadron commander who pioneered methods of basically fighting the Germans on the Western Front in 1940. One of his airmen in No. 1 Squadron, John Kilmartin, became an ace on the first day of the Battle of France and had 10 confirmed kills before the campaign was over. Tim Vigors achieved his first kill while flying air cover missions over Dunkirk, and Brendan Paddy Fanucan became operational on the 15th of July 1940. And Paddy Fanucan, born during the War of Independence, the son of a 1916 veteran, Thomas Andrew Fanucan, and a strong-willed English mother, was accepted to the RAF in August 1938. He didn't show much promise, and he joined No. 65 Squadron at Hornchurch on the 13th of July 1940. He achieved 2 of his kills and 2 probables in August-September 1940. He commanded No. 452 Squadron from April 1941 and achieved 20 kills. He commanded No. 602 Squadron from January 1942 with 6 kills. And in June 1942, he became the youngest wing commander in RAF history, but he was lost over the Channel. It is pilots like Paddy Fanucan who inherited the legacy of Edward McManus, and in some ways, the ghost of Mannock pushed Fanucan and other airmen like him forward into the service, and in some ways, I suppose, drove them to their own tumult in the clouds. And this is probably one of the reasons why Irish service in the Royal Air Force continued as it did right into the Second World War, and why the RAF is still a popular choice for Irish airmen today. Thank you very much.
The next poem I will read is The Lamp of Joy by Noor Inayat Khan. A mermaid once went in a ship upon the stormy sea, and as she sailed along, the waves arose and sprung in glee. For on the ship she hung a lamp, which gave a light so sweet that anyone who saw its glow with joy was sure to meet.
Thank you so much for that lovely poem. My name is Shrabani Basu, and I'm a biographer of Noor Inayat Khan, who I will talk about for the next 20 minutes. Well, before that, thank you, Maggie, for organizing this, and Peter, and all of you for being here as well. So who was this mysterious woman, Noor Inayat Khan? And, well, in September 1944, she was lying dead on the floor of a concentration camp in Dachau. How did she land there? How did this Indian woman, what was her journey, was something that really intrigued me. So I'll try to take you, on a journey through her, very briefly through her life as well today. So Noor, this is Noor's father. His name was Hazrat Inayat Khan. He was from Western India in Baroda, and he left India to travel to the West, to take Sufism to the West. Sufism is a branch of Islam which believes in music and meditation, and he was a musician. As you can see, he's playing the veena, and he was told by his teacher to venture out. So he took his brothers, he was a good Indian, he took his brothers, here they are, and they all traveled to the US. So they called themselves the Royal Musicians of Hindustan. Here they are in their golden turbans. They were quite a hit, this band went around. It was in California that Hazrat Inayat Khan, he met this beautiful American lady called Ora Ray Baker, and they fell in love, and they got married. They came to London to get married, and soon Ora took on her husband's Sufism faith, and she started wearing a sari and a veil, and she was christened Amina Begum. So the family now lived in London, and then he got a call to go to Moscow, because he was a musician, to play in a salon in Moscow. And it was here in 1914 that Noor was born. So this is baby Noor with her father, Hazrat Inayat Khan. And he called her Babuli. Babuli in Hindustani means daughter, sort of beloved daughter. But of course, at this time, there's political discontent in Moscow, and the family feel they have to leave. So back they come to London, where they spend the next few years, and 3 more children are born to Hazrat and his wife. And here they are. So you can see Noor, she's the one with the ribbon. She sort of mothers them all. And they live in London, for about till 1920, actually. They live the First World War out in London. They live in a house in Gordon Square. And they move. Hazrat Inayat Khan was a patriot. He sang for the Indian soldiers during First World War. He sang for Gandhi. And so, because he was Muslim, the British administration were actually following him. They were a bit suspicious of him. So somebody advised him, go away, go to France. They're much friendlier. And he went to France. So a Sufi follower gave him this, presented them with this big house. And this is where they lived. It's on the outskirts of Paris in a place called Suresnes. It's on a hill, and they called it Fazl Manzil, which means house of blessing. Now, Fazl Manzil became a house of an open house for the Sufis, for music and meditation, and they would tolerate all the religions. A candle would be lit to every religion. So this is the background in which Noor grew up. And you can see them as children here. They've all children love dressing up. So here they were wearing these Indian clothes, turbans and saris, playing around. It was a very idyllic childhood. But when Noor was just 12 years old, her father, Hazrat Inayat Khan, wanted to go back to India. He hadn't been back, and he was missing his country. And somehow the family knew that he wouldn't come back. So he went to India, and he died in Delhi, and he was buried there. And suddenly, this world has come crashing down for this family. Her mother, who left everything to join Hazrat Inayat Khan, was absolutely, went into depression. She wouldn't come out of her bedroom. And it fell on Noor at a very young age to look after her family. So I think this sense of responsibility started very early for her. So here, and she tries to draw her mother out of this depression. She writes these poems for her. And as Noor is growing up as a young teenager, she actually manages to persuade her mother to come out of this depression, to be part of the outside world. And she herself is growing up. She goes to the Sorbonne. She studies child psychology. She's a musician. Here, the family. Noor learned the harp. She went to the École Normale. She learned to play the harp. She learned composition under Nadia Boulanger. So it was a very cultured, genteel life in that sense. So her siblings were all musicians. As you can see, they formed a quartet. They would hold concerts in Fazl Manzil and in their music school. At this time, Noor also fell in love. She fell in love with a Jewish musician. But somewhere, the family didn't approve. They thought he was sort of really draining her of energy, and he was too dominant a person. But she was conflicted between family and her love, and she wrote a lot of poems at this stage. She also wanted to learn her father's instrument, the veena. So here she is, playing the veena in the Oriental Room. And she also started at this stage writing children's stories. So she is, I'm taking you through this to give her background of her character. She's a dreamer, she's a musician, she's a writer of children's stories. And here she is on a holiday in The Hague. And by now she had started writing her stories are published in the Paris newspapers. And she publishes her first book, excuse me, 20 Jataka tales. These are stories from Buddha, and they're like the Aesop's fables. And so Noor selects 20 of them, and this is published. It's published in 1939 in London. And of course, we know, 1939, the war clouds are gathering around Europe. And in 1940, this is Noor now as a young adult. She's strikingly beautiful. This is the family. And in 1940, with the German army about to enter Paris, she and her brother, Vilayat is the third from the left, she was very close to her brother Vilayat. They take a decision. They sit in this Oriental Room, of which you've seen the photos, and they say that we are Sufis, we believe in non-violence, but we can't stand by and watch this. We can't watch what's happening in Europe. So they take the decision to move to England to support the war effort. And so, like all the refugees who are leaving Paris, Vilayat gets into his beaten-up old car and they drive out of Paris. They catch the last ferry. They are in England, and as they're going, they're being bombed by the Stukas. And Vilayat just says, "I'm going to go back and join the RAF." And Noor says, "And I'll join the women's wing." And that's exactly how it happens. So they reach London. Bombed out London, Vilayat signs up for the RAF, and Noor signs up for the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. So here she is in her uniform. She was very proud of this uniform. And suddenly she is just a number. She's aircraft's woman with a number, and she actually loves it. It suddenly, in a way, a lot of women felt very liberated during the war. They were doing different things. They were doing the jobs that men did previously. And Noor, from this sheltered background that you saw, where the men, the uncles, her brothers, everybody's sort of around her, very cocooned, very genteel atmosphere. She's suddenly out. She's sleeping in a Nissan hut, and with other colleagues, and she's actually loving it. And she goes on to be trained as a radio operator. So she is practicing her Morse code, and she is very good at it. So I've seen these reports in the RAF, and it says VG. She's very good. But while Noor is banging away at her Morse code and being really good at it, she is being watched by this very secret organization called the SOE, the Special Operations Executive. And they are looking out for people with language skills. Now, Noor, of course, brought up in Paris, speaks French fluently like a native, and knows the streets of Paris. She knows the alleyways. She knows the bistros. She's very good at radio operation. Now, this was a job that had been previously done only by men. And I'll get into later why it was so dangerous. But Noor is now sent a letter. She's called for an interview. She has no idea what it's about. She does her hair, she spends money, she's very excited, she thinks she's going to get a promotion. She goes there and she's in this one small room with one light bulb and one person interviewing her, who's talking to her in French. And very quickly she's told that she would be sent undercover to France, false passport, false identity, and she will have to help the resistance movements in France. She won't be in uniform, so she has no protection, and if she is caught, she will be shot. And will she take the job? And Noor says yes, because it's not a knee-jerk reaction. She had come here determined, she'd come to London to do her bit, and she was going to do it no matter what. So Noor accepts the offer, and she is now going to start a new phase of her life. She's going to be trained as a secret agent. So these are the country houses which are spread across England. And this is where the agents were trained. This photo is from Bewley in Hampshire. It is still there. It's actually now the National Motor Museum. You can see it. There's a plaque to the agents who were trained there. One of their instructors was Kim Philby, who then went on to be a double agent. But anyway, in this venue, they are trained in not just Morse, but secret life, how to recruit an agent, a dead letterbox, how to send messages through live letterboxes, how to recognize the enemy, the uniforms, how to pick a lock, and of course, how to fire. So arms training, something that Noor did not enjoy, and for which her report says, scared of arms training. She was, but she knew she had to do it, so she's going to do it. She'll bite that bullet, she'll do it. She was also a very fast runner, so that is one thing she's good at. She's good at clambering on roofs. And so her training continues, and before it's even completed, they are so desperate in France because, as I said, the radio operators, the life expectancy of a radio operator was 6 weeks. They were dropping like flies. They needed replacement. And Noor Inayat Khan becomes the first woman radio operator to be infiltrated into occupied France. So this is her code name, Madeline, which you can see she's practicing very rigorously. And on the night of 16th June, she is flown in a Lysander. It was always a midnight flight, a full moon night, because the landing space had to be visible to the pilot. And of course, the danger of this is that the plane is also fully visible to the Germans on the ground who can fire at the plane. So she's taken on this plane, Lysander. There is a Lysander in this museum, so do go look at it. She's taken there, she lands in France. It has to be really quick. She gets out, she has to join the circuit, find her way to Paris, and she joins the circuit headed by Francis Suttle. He's a barrister from London, and she sends her first message within 72 hours of landing, fastest from any of the radio operators in the field. So there she is, starting her job, but disaster awaits. In a week, their circuit is blown. There's been an informer. This was happening all the time. And so her entire circuit, Francis, everybody, the other radio operators, all arrested, and she's left alone. Now, London asks her to return and says it's very dangerous, but she says no. She goes into hiding. She says she's the last link left between Paris and London, and she's going to continue. So there is this other SOE operative. His name is Franz Anthelm. She goes into hiding with him. She tries to build the circuit, and she carries on. So this, just to say, the old Noor Inayat Khan, the gentle, musician and dreamer, is suddenly transformed into Madeline, the British spy. And there is a steely side to Noor. As you can see in this picture, she is determined to do her job. And she does. For 3 months, she works in one of the most dangerous areas in the field. And now I'll tell you why these radios are so dangerous. Because, they are, as you can see, disguised in a suitcase, which she has to carry. It weighs about 15 kilos, so it's not light. She'll be on the metro carrying this suitcase. She can be questioned by any SS officer or the Gestapo. And it happens. So she has to talk her way out of situations. She's found in the metro and they say, "What are you carrying, mademoiselle?" And she just opens the suitcase a little bit and says, "Oh, it's photography equipment. And can't you see all the light bulbs?" And this person has never seen, doesn't know what these involve. He's not going to admit it, of course. So he says, "Oh, yes, you can go." Gets off at the next stop, runs for her life, and gets out. So she has several narrow escapes. And the other thing with this wireless set is it's got an aerial, which is 15 meters long, that you have to hang up. So once she has to send an urgent message, and she just goes outside the flat, and she starts putting it up on a tree. And suddenly there's somebody who says, "Excuse me, mademoiselle." Turns around. It's an SS officer who lives in the same apartments. So Noor just plays along. She puts on all her charm and she says, I just wanted to listen to a radio station. And she names a banned radio station which plays music. The Nazis have banned several radio stations. So it's like she's doing a small, breaking a small law. And of course, this officer is so, floored by this woman. He just says, "Oh, I'll help you put it up, mademoiselle." And he helps her put up this aerial. And within minutes, he has no idea that she is transmitting to London. So Noor gets away, but she has been getting away very quickly, but she is in, as I said, the dangerous place. There are informers everywhere. There's curfew at nights. It's a different occupied Paris is a different place from where she grew up, and as a child, as a young adult. And of course, the news is tightening around her. She survives for 3 months doing crucial work, whereas, remember, the life expectancy was 6 weeks. London is absolutely fascinated that she has managed, this dreamer, this unlikely spy has managed to survive. But the news is tightening around her. This is that famous photograph of Hitler who didn't want to bomb the Eiffel Tower because he liked it too much. And there are informers, and Noor is betrayed. Her address is given away to the Nazis for 100,000 francs. And of course, once they have her address, they can just go in there, they enter her flat, and they arrest her. So, of course, she fights. She's not giving up, easily. She bites her captor. He can't take her away alone. He has to bring in reinforcements. Takes 6 burly men to take this young, very petite 5'3" woman and bundle her into a car and take her to the prison, which is at Avenue Foch in Paris. 84 Avenue Foch was the Gestapo headquarters. And I don't know if there's a light here, but so the attic you can see, or right on top, is where they kept the prisoners. Now Noor makes 2 attempts. She makes an escape attempt immediately, but she's caught. The second attempt is, really worked out with 2 other men, and they climb onto the roof, and they would have escaped. It would have been one of those daring escapes, like from Colditz. But the RAF at that time start bombing, and the air raid sirens go off. So immediately they check the prisoners' rooms, they find them empty. 3 missing on the roof, they catch them. And he's going to, the head of the Gestapo there, he is the commandant. He's going to just fire at her. He's just going to shoot her. But he can't bring himself to do it. So what does he do? He picks up the phone. Noor is too hot to handle. He calls Berlin and he says, "Get her out of here." So she is now removed to a prison in Germany. The first woman agent to be taken to a prison in Germany. It's a prison in the Black Forest called Pforzheim Prison. And she is kept there, incarcerated, chains binding her in isolation. So her hands are tied, her feet are tied. There's a chain passing from her feet to her hands. So she can't clean herself, she can't feed herself, she has to just hop. And she is, this happens for 10 months. She's tortured, beaten, doesn't give away anything. And finally, she is removed to Dachau concentration camp. And these are the gates of Dachau. It's here that she is then tortured brutally all night, and finally gun pointed at her head, and she is shot through the head. But she goes down screaming, "Liberté," so they can't break her spirit. Her body is thrown into the crematoriums. There were 3 other agents who were also killed with her, and the ashes were scattered on the grounds. There is now a flower garden there which says Graves of Thousands Unknown. And this is a plaque in the memorial room in Dachau. It says she is known in France as Madeline of the Resistance. And, well, her story was really forgotten for many, many years. And then I wrote her biographies by Princess and campaigned for a memorial for her, because I got a lot of letters from readers who thought she needed to be her story needed to be known. So that's the memorial in Gordon Square, and it was unveiled by Princess Anne, so it was a very proud day. And last year, it's a beautiful memorial, so do go see it. It's near Euston Square. And, well, then we got a stamp for her, because Royal Mail wanted to issue a stamp. And last year, we unveiled a blue plaque in her honor outside the house where she lived in London. So, you know, there's a little part of Bloomsbury, which is very much Noor, and a little part of this museum, which is Noor. So, you know, just it's wonderful to know that her story is now remembered and told. So thank you all. Thanks for listening.
Well, that was fantastic. I really enjoyed both papers. I found particularly the last really moving. I mean, it's, you know, a powerful story. It really does connect, and I think that's probably the reason it's had so much resonance. I think Maggie spoke with great passion about it as well. It really does, I think, connect with people. So I'm really delighted we can share it. We've got time for questions. We're running a little behind, so I think we'll take 10 minutes. We'll go to coffee, and we'll come back, I think, about 12:05. So if you've got any questions, if you could raise your hand. We've got one here. So if we take the mic, and if we've got a question over here, we'll get it over there before. Do we have any questions on this side? Don't be shy. This is a good time. Oh, you're going to regret it later. Okay. Yes, please, Renee.
Shrabani, I just wanted to ask, I hope I didn't miss it, but why the princess spy?
Oh, right, yes.
Thank you.
Is this on? Yeah, I guess it was a very short presentation. So she is descended from Tipu Sultan. Tipu Sultan was the ruler of Mysore in southern India in the 18th century. And that's why the princess bit. Interestingly, Tipu Sultan died fighting the British, but he was killed in the battle in 1799, and his throne is in Windsor Castle. The tiger is in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And her father, Hazrat Inayat Khan, would tell all of them that you have the blood of Tipu in your veins. So I think it gave them a lot of courage as well. So he was called the Tiger of Mysore.
Thank you. Okay, do we have another question?
Thank you both. Absolutely fascinating, wonderful talks. Joe, I just wanted to, you gave some really interesting reasons why Irish people joined the Royal Air Force. There's somebody that really interests me. I'm not sure he even was Irish particularly, but Gordon Shepherd. Do you know Gordon Shepherd? At the very beginning of the First World War, he was one of the first flyers who, did the reconnaissance and became the highest-ranking airman to actually die in combat during the First World War. In the month before the war, I think I'm right in saying, he was bringing arms from Germany to Ireland, and these were the arms that were used in the Easter Rising, which I find completely fascinating. A serving member of the Royal Flying Corps who's bringing the arms that were used in the... What was that? I mean, do you know anything about that?
Well, the thing about it is, now that doesn't surprise me at all. Now, I know a little... Sorry. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay.
Joe, why don't you come and use the podium? Put that one down.
I'm too tall. It's a fantastic question, and the best way to answer it is, I suppose, think of the most famous example of somebody who did that at the same time, and that's Erskine Childers, author of Riddle of the Sands. So he goes from writing a book about a conspiracy against the United Kingdom, against Britain, by Germany, an invasion, to then within 2 years, smuggling arms, 2-3 years, smuggling arms into Ireland on board the German-made arms on board the yacht, the Asgard. And then when the war breaks out, he ends up, I can't remember his exact role, but he ends up effectively fighting in the British Armed Services, or in some connection with the British civil services that are connected with the fighting forces. And then he's back in to the Irish nationalist movement. He's involved. He's an elected TD, or Irish MP. He's part of the Irish Revolution, and although he's not really involved so much in the insurgency during the War of Independence, he does bear arms around the time of the Irish Civil War, and ends up actually being executed for possession of a firearm, which was actually given to him as a gift by Michael Collins. It was really tragic. So he's kind of flipping back and forth, while also, and this is a not an unfamiliar pattern in terms of people's individual choices. There's Irish nationalists who tend to flip back and forth, like Emmett Dalton is a Military Cross winner in the Somme, and then he ends up being Michael Collins's top military commander in the general headquarters of the Irish Republican Army. And then he's a Free State Army general, and he's working with the British while he's a Free State Army general. He's cooperating with British Royal Naval officers during the Free State Army landings in Cork. And he retains his connections with the British services and with the intelligence services in particular. And it's one of the things about, I suppose, the Irish Republican movement is it has a very conspicuous link with both the British Armed Forces and the intelligence services. In any period of 20th century history that you care to look, there's people who go back and forth between the British forces or the British civil service and the Irish Republican movement, and it's quite fascinating, really. So I suppose that the person that you're referring to, Shepherd, typifies this kind of individual.
It's really interesting what you say, because he was great friends with Erskine Childers.
Yeah, exactly. He was involved in all of those operations. There were several runs. There were several, about 3 or 4 that were made to smuggle arms into Ireland. Thank you.
Yes, we've got a question there. If we take a question on the right first.
Me?
Yes, and should be on.
Hi, can you hear me? That's lovely. Dr. Quinn, thank you so much. It was really very interesting. I am the granddaughter of somebody who was in the Royal Flying Corps. My grandfather joined in 1916 in Dublin. I think there's so much that isn't known. Most people don't realise that there were bases in Ireland. So my grandfather was attached to Bellegarde base. He worked for the Dublin United Tramways Company, and I wonder if you can tell us, so a lot of the skills would have been kept in Ireland, aircraft technicians used, but most people don't have absolutely no idea of what these men did. So people like my grandfather were already working. And how did that come about that they would have joined the Royal Flying Corps in 1916 particularly? Thank you so much.
Well, I'm going to give you an interesting take on that. It's not just the skills coming in from skilled men, like skilled technicians and people effectively with the equivalent of engineering skills, such as your great grandfather, is that? Grandfather. Apologies. It's not just the skills that they're bringing. They're bringing those skills into the Royal Flying Corps at a point where it's in a critical phase of development. Aircraft are getting faster. Combat technology, the speed of its development is accelerating from quantum leap to quantum leap, not on a yearly basis, but on a monthly basis. So these skilled individuals are coming into a service that's in development, that's in flux at a very critical stage. So the need for those kind of skills was very important. But I like to think also of the kind of skills that a lot of Irishmen brought back to Ireland, and refer to the 2 individuals who are the founders of effectively what's now the Irish Air Corps. Another service I'd like to think of, there's the Aer Lingus, the Irish state airline, a lot of individuals who joined Aer Lingus after the Second World War were ex-RAF pilots, particularly Lancaster pilots. Essentially that airline was built upon the skills of ex-RAF technicians, ground staff, mechanics, engineers, any particular role which was applicable to, the aviation world or the world of airlines. They brought in ex-RAF men to do it, and ex-Irish Air Corps, but there was very little difference between the two services in terms of their technical training. And a lot of Irish airmen that went into the RAF, whether they were ordinary ranks, non-commissioned officers, or officer rank, they were expected to have a fairly advanced level of technical knowledge or mathematical knowledge. So they were both absorbing the skills that were in existence from people coming from technical colleges and from, sort of advanced secondary schools, and particular people with mathematics and a grasp of physics. And they were bringing them into the air service. And then for those who came back, they were actually redeploying those skills in the development of what's now modern Ireland, in the Electricity Supply Board, that's the state electricity company, and the state airline Aer Lingus, which is effectively built from scratch after the Second World War and expands massively. And it's really, if you look at the role of airline pilots that Aer Lingus are employing between 1945 and 1960, vast majority of probably 60-70% are ex-Bomber Command or ex-Fighter Command pilots. It's amazing.
Great. Thank you. Both really interesting papers. I have a question, one for each of you. So the first one is, so how did those who served in the RAF and then went and joined the IRA, was there any sense of animosity among some of the IRA hardliners towards those who served in the RAF? And then the second question in relation to Noor is, how did her sort of religious and ethnic background sort of affect the way she was treated serving in the RAF, and if it did so? Thank you.
Would you mind if Shrabani, could I allow you to go first to answer your other question? Thank you. I'm talking too much.
Right. Right, that's really an interesting question, actually. So Noor's background is not easy, and there's several conflicts. So being a Sufi, she is non-violent, but she's going to go into a field. She's going into the front line. Being her father being Indian, a very sort of nationalist, supporting Indian, descendant of Tipu, all that is also, she was a fierce believer in Indian independence. So she's actually called for this interview at the RAF, and they question her and they ask her, where does your loyalty lie? Would it lie with India? Would it lie? Because at this time, in 1940, what's happening in India is that the Congress Party, all the leaders of the Congress Party, they've all been put behind bars. Everyone, they spent the whole of the war, Nehru, Gandhi, they're all locked up. So there is this awareness, and Noor is very aware of the political situation in India. She believes in Indian independence, and she's asked point blank, where do your loyalties lie? And she's really angry because they ask her this question. She loses her temper, and she says, at this moment, it is imperative that we fight this war, that we defeat the Nazis. And at this time, I am with you. After the war is over, I'll support Indian independence. And she just puts it out there frankly. And, people interviewing her, they are shocked by her frankness. But at the same time, I think they see that, they see this straight, that she is just speaking the truth. This is it. And as long as she is fighting this war, she is on our side, which is what she showed. Of course, she didn't survive the war. Her brother Hidayat got quite close to the family afterwards, and if she had survived the war, she would have gone to India and fought for independence. That was Noor. So, there were all these conflicts. It's very much like the Irish story. I just find so many similarities. After the war, the stories of these people who fought in the RAF, fought in all, in various battles, was forgotten in India. They were not, the Indian heroes were those who fought for independence. And the story of the soldiers and the Air Force men was completely forgotten. So it's only now that this awareness is increasing. Because they were seen as somebody, people who sided with the empire, with the British. And so the freedom fighters were the ones who were the new heroes of India. But that is changing now. People see the broader perspective, as they should, and they know why, and the sacrifices they made. So yeah, it's not an easy thing, but that is sort of putting it broadly.
I might have to test you here, Joe, by asking you quite quick. Okay. Again, I think use this one. That's
Musical chairs. I have to echo Shrabani's comparisons between Ireland and India. It's exactly that. In fact, if you're talking about two former imperial territories or former colonies of the empire that are most like one another, it's Ireland and India. It really is. There's so many similarities. We have pretty much similar constitutions, even though our respective countries are completely mine's one of the smallest countries in the world. India is one of the largest countries in the world. It's remarkable, the similarities between those two countries when you look at their history, when you look at the social structures, everything. And this is also echoing the similarities in terms of people who serve in the British Armed Forces, how they're viewed by Irish nationalists, and it kind of echoes another thing that Shrabani mentioned about how most people who served in the armed forces ended up being forgotten. In Ireland, it was less being forgotten as opposed to a kind of a great silence. Sort of people didn't speak about it. Okay, there was what David Fitzpatrick, Professor of Modern Irish History at Trinity College, Professor David Fitzpatrick, referred to not as the Great Amnesia, but the Great Asphasia, where people didn't speak about it. And so the cultural memory kind of lapsed, and it's only recently been revived. But in terms of answering your question about how did members of the Irish Republican Army feel, initially people who they were known as ex-Britishers, and people who had served in the armed forces, and they included top IRA commanders, people like Tom Barry, who commanded the West Cork Flying Column, one of the most active insurgent leaders. They included people like Emmett Dalton, who's effectively like a leading IRA commander, and probably Michael Collins is one of his best generals. And there were several others who are ex-British Army officers and, are ordinary ranks or ex-sergeants who had served in the British Army in the First World War. The man who was believed to have assassinated Collins at Bale Blah was a British Army trained sniper in the Royal Munster Fusiliers. So the thing is that there were ex-British servicemen everywhere, not as many as people think, but they were in conspicuous places. And yes, some of them were tested. Tom Barry was tested a bit by the people who recruited him into the IRA. They questioned his loyalty. They worried that he might be an infiltrator, but they saw that when he was genuine. And even those two men that I referred to, Colonel Russell and McSweeney, those men were probed by Emmett Dalton in a meeting to see if they were reliable. And they were already in the IRA. And they were probed, and when Emmett Dalton was satisfied that they were loyal, then he commissioned them to plan the escape attempt. So there were constantly suspicions about people who were ex-British military. And in the Civil War, when basically people had to choose a side, the Free State or the anti-treaty movement, the ex-Britishers' issues became an issue towards the end of the Civil War, when it came to who was going to be retained in this national army that had to be demobilised. And there was a preference by the government and the military authorities to retain people with ex-British military service. And this led to IRA officers and effectively generals in the Free State Army who had come up through the IRA threatening a military coup against the government. Mainly because they said all these snobs have been kept on in the army, these British trained snobs, and we're all been kicked out. So yeah, there was a bit of an antipathy there, but at the same time, the value that these ex-British servicemen brought into the Irish forces was beyond estimation.
Okay, well, thank you both very much. We're going to take a break now. Done a terrible job of keeping time, I'm afraid. So they were both so interesting, and that last question I was going to cut it off, and I was like, well, it's too fascinating not to get into. But I'm really pleased that I haven't had to use up my questions, because we're going to come back at the round table. I've got a store I'm going to tease through. So our next session, I think we're going to begin at 12:10 now. There's coffee available in the art gallery, which is across the foyer. We can show you where it is, can't we, Nina? excellent. I love a nodding head, which is always good. But when we come back, we're going to hear from Harry Ladbois, who is going to talk about the Indian service in the Second World War, and Russell Smith, who's going to talk about Errol Barrow. And it's both, I was going to say brand new research, but I feel that's mean to say that as if this isn't really cutting edge, because I think it is. If we have time, I'm going to give my paper. I think I might have to cut mine down. But I'm really pleased to have had this session, so thank you both very much. Can we thank our speakers?